I'll be talking about how we can make immersive tech more usable by gaining a better understanding of how users expect things to work during design. I've been working as a user experience consultant for over 15 years now, working for many different companies that you may know and across many different platforms. But today, I very much focus on AR and VR, running design research to try and understand what does and doesn't work in terms of interaction. So let's jump in and start to unpack what we mean by design research and why it's important. So it might help to start with a recognized process for designing complex interactive systems. So this is the ISO Human-Centered Design Standard, which is essentially a design process that puts human users at the very heart of it and involves them all the way through. And research takes place at many different stages. At the start, we try to find out exactly who the users are, what they need to do, what features they're likely to value, and we try and understand as much as possible about the context of use. Later on, the product team will start to design solutions with all the features and interactions to create a product that works for users. But what's really important is testing those designs with the users, addressing any critical issues that arise and repeating this process until we know the users are going to have the experience that we want them to have. This is obviously the ideal process. Now, I'll be focusing on this iterative design and testing component because we keep hearing from users and from businesses that the UX of many immersive tech applications needs to be better. And this is a key factor that may be affecting adoption today. In fact, a survey this year by global law firm Perkins Coie of 140 industry professionals found that the #1 perceived barrier to adoption for the second year in a row for both AR and VR was poor UX. So what aspects of the design do we need to test? Well, ideally all of it, but in particular whenever the user has to interact with information and content, and anything that's new that they're unlikely to have experienced, and in particular anything that's critical to the success of your application. So we have to ask, what would happen if users were not able to use this particular part of the experience? And if the answer is it would significantly undermine the whole value of the app or compromise the very goals of what you're trying to do, then we should test that. And when we say test with users, what do we mean? What sort of things do we look out for? So let's look at a couple of examples, if we can play the video. So do users notice these on-screen prompts? Do they understand that menu is contextual to the object that they've picked up? Do the icons make sense? Is the location correct? Does the orientation help? Do they know how to make a selection? Is the feedback from that selection clear? And what about this tool? Will they know what to do with it? And is the feedback reinforcing their understanding of how it works? Let's look at another example. So this is a gaze-based system. So the main form of interaction and selection is through the gaze cursor. So it's very important that the user can see the gaze cursor and track it continuously. If we could play the video. Do they also understand what they can and can't interact with? Is it clear when an interaction has started? Do these panels appear in the right place? What do users actually look at and read? Do they understand the actions to progress forward? How do they navigate between all of these screens? And what if they want to go backwards or close the menu? Can they do all of these things? So there are lots of design questions we have to ask. And for each, there's a multitude of variables and options that we can get right or wrong. We're still at the stage as an industry where we're trying to figure out what best practice is. So it's really important to test with your users in order to understand how they're likely to respond in each of these different situations. It's actually very easy to get it wrong. We tend to also focus a lot on the immersiveness, the compelling 3D space, the real-time tracking of your hands, so it feels like those are your real hands in VR, or the behavior of 3D holograms in AR, so that they obey the laws of physics. And these are really fascinating features, and they're the qualities that make users say, wow, when they try immersive tech. But when we do user research and testing, we find relatively few issues with this. It's when the user tries to interact with something and do something and get the same sort of return for their efforts as you would expect from a usable mobile app. That's where we see all the issues. And usually there's quite a lot of them, and they can be quite severe to the point where users get confused or stuck and cannot continue. We very often hear users say things like, I couldn't get it to do what I was trying, or I could have done that quicker on my mobile phone. These are some of the areas where we repeatedly see interaction issues. So understanding what you can interact with, we see users trying to interact with everything or missing the things they're supposed to interact with. There are issues with menus. So I believe menus are going to be really important for some time to come, whether they're 2D or 3D, but how do we create a good menu for immersive tech? How do we ensure that users find the menu and are able to access it when they need to, but then they can make it disappear when they no longer need it? It sounds really simple, but we see so many issues with this. Orientation as well. How do we direct users' attention in a 3D space and ensure they're always facing the right direction? We also have further complexity if there are external trackers that the user also has to face. We're still kind of at the stage where little nuances in the design make a huge difference in helping the user to understand what they need to do. Little clues that are just enough to nudge the user into trying the desired behavior. These are the details of the UX, and the way we figure them out is by testing the designs with users and learning from that. There's also a very strong business case for following this kind of process. It's been proven before with other platforms. For example, IBM found that the total financial benefits can be 10 to 100 times the cost invested into the UX work. And this was repeated over numerous software development projects. Other case studies point to the big savings in development costs, because if you're identifying critical issues early in design when it's very easy to fix them, fixing the same issue later during development or once you've released a product is going to be much more expensive. There are lots of other case studies. I won't go into all of them, but there's lots of published ones. This last one from McAfee, they achieved a 90% reduction in support costs because most of the issues that would have required support were actually captured by usability testing and designed out. So we also hear many successful startups attribute their success to the efforts they've put into UX. And I guess, or I hope we all kind of agree on this, that UX is very important. But I think we have to keep putting the same level of effort into UX for AR and VR. And I know a lot of companies are doing this, but I believe that if we want to increase adoption and unlock the full potential of these platforms, we do need a better user experience than what we're often getting. So let's say I'm convinced and I want to do more of this testing with users. How would I do it? When would I do it? Well, you can actually test things much earlier than you might think. Obviously, we can't test the full immersive application till quite late on in the design and development cycle. But that's not where we're finding all the issues. It's with the interactions. And we can start to test those much earlier on through low-fidelity prototypes. So, for example, if I want to know, do I have the right features? Will this app definitely deliver value to the users? I don't need to build the whole application. I can start to create initial mock-ups or storyboards that showcase the features that will be included and elements of the UI, and I can start to get feedback early on. If I want to understand if the contents of a particular menu are going to make sense or the sequence of screens in an interaction are in the right order, again, I can start to get feedback early on through low-fidelity prototypes. So let's look at some examples of things that you can do. You can create animations that showcase a particular use case or interaction. If we could play that video, please. This one's really simple, but it only takes a couple of hours to put this together, and you can start to put that in front of users. You can also start to think about how the controller works and showcase that. Now, I know with AR and VR now, there's more and more authoring tools that allow you to create real workflows pretty quickly. I think we just saw an example in the last talk. But whatever you decide to use, it's important to test it with the users and iterate your design. It's very hard to get it right first time. We can also use paper prototyping early on, kind of 3D version. So we found this really useful at prototyping interactive menus launched from wearable components or from the hands, and also about understanding the spatial layout of interactive objects and panels. So you can mount these things on boards and on stands and kind of watch the user move between them or even rearrange them. And it really gives the user a sense of these things existing in a three-dimensional space, something that you don't get from flat mock-ups or animations. And I know there are now rapid prototyping tools, such as Sketchbox, starting to emerge that also allow you to do these things. So you have lots of different options. So these early prototypes help to confirm the utility and the design at a very conceptual level, but they don't really help with the core issue of usability, because for that, the user does need to experience something closer to the real immersive environment. And again, we can use things like Sketchbox to quickly prototype, but sometimes you do have to go into Unity, WebVR, Unreal, so some coding may be required, but it's possible to create realistic front-end interactions without having to build the entire app. And that will allow you to test and refine those interactions whilst the rest of the content's being put together. It's not something that you should leave to the very end. So with interactive prototypes, we recommend some form of usability testing. This is where a moderator sits with the user and actually observes them interacting with the prototype. Now, it's important it's as close as possible to the actual user, and what they're doing is quite realistic. Because what we want to know is, can they do the specific things that are critical to your app's success? Often you might do this research in a dedicated UX lab, or you can do it in the context of use, particularly if that's important for understanding the performance of the design. There are a few different ways of doing this that might be relevant. So we use task-based evaluation if we want to test if users can use a particular feature, or if they can achieve a particular goal. And therefore, we know all the information and interactions along the way make sense. We can measure things like task completion rates, time to complete task, the accuracy with which a task is completed, and the mental and physical effort on the part of the user. All of this could be quite useful, for example, in an enterprise setting. And examples of tasks could be things like performing a maintenance check on a piece of machinery, or accessing a specific option in a settings menu, or using a communication tool to communicate with somebody. So stuff that has a clear end goal. But many immersive experiences have kind of gameplay and storytelling as a core component of what they do. So task completion rates aren't always as interesting as understanding the overall impact of the interaction. So we have different methods, things like playtesting that have evolved from computer games research. And here users are able to explore the app in a much more natural way, and we kind of observe that. We're interested in things like their emotional response to what they're seeing. Can they control the things they need to control? Do they understand when to sit back and enjoy versus when they should be interacting with things? So you have slightly different methods and frameworks depending on what your app does. So I've got a few examples from actual UX tests, so you can kind of see the stuff that you might get from there. So if we could play this video.
You mentioned you wanted to escape from this room and have a look at the other
That's
rooms.
me.
How would you do that? If you want to,
There is a user there. He's been blurred out just for the purposes of sharing.
Okay. So we've had enough of this room. We want to get out of here. Is it possible to do that?
So the user's done all the content in this room, and they have to leave to explore the rest of the app. We can see where they're looking, what they try to do. You can almost get a feel of what they're thinking.
What would you expect?
I'd expect, maybe let's just say, for example, there's a door in front of me, I'd look at it and it'd be highlighted. You then press a button, hold it down for 3 to 5 seconds, and it should say, when you look at it, very light, kind of white letters say, hold to exit, or something like that.
Right. So there are no doors you can escape from. Do you have any other ideas of how it could work?
Maybe the circle?
Nope, it's not the circle.
Okay, if you try some of the other buttons actually, so B might have not been correct, it was B yesterday.
Oh, okay. So I hit the menu button. Front entrance, okay. Thing is, I had no idea about that. This is why a little thing in your hand, and then you could look at it and says, and it shows your controller.
So you really get to understand how they expect it to work. In this case, there was no visual indication that you need to switch to the menu, switch to the controller to launch the menu, and something like that can be enough to be a showstopper. So you can pick this up in testing. We have another example here for mobile AR, so if we could play this video. Here the user needs to place three-dimensional objects onto flat surfaces in order to access the content and interact with them.
So this happened a lot when I was first trying to use it with so I'd get this up, but then I couldn't get anything else to happen. And
So you need to do a long press
before it said to
until the
press
circle
it.
fills.
You notice when you press it that
Yeah.
the circle gets bigger. If you press it and you look at the white circle.
Ah, okay. Oh no, it's gone completely now. It's fine.
And the users here had been using this app for a week before they came in for the sessions.
But yeah, this is, oh.
Sometimes
So what
it's
you
hard
need
to
do is
watch.
when you press it, you need to
Yeah.
keep it held until the white circle gets to the edge. So if you try it again,
But if you don't test, your real users could be having this experience, and you'd never know.
There we go. It's still coming up.
So in this case, the actual main menu for accessing all the other content was a 3D object. So if you couldn't place that, it was kind of a game over for the user. So again, little nuances in the way the interactions are designed. Not necessarily the 3D immersive part of the experience, just the simple interactions. If we get those wrong, that could really undermine how the app works. So I mentioned you could do this in a UX lab. This is what one that's kind of optimized for immersive tech looks like. There are some differences to a regular UX lab. If you're interested in what those are, happy to talk to you afterwards and explain. Some of the more advanced techniques that we have today, so we can do eye tracking on VR applications built in Unity. And that allows us to see where the user's looking in VR, the order in which they look at things, and even track their path through a 3D space. So really powerful additional information we wouldn't get just from a regular test session. And there are eye trackers now available for HoloLens as well. Also, because of the nature, the immersive nature of immersive tech, obviously, and because of the common goals around evoking emotions and storytelling, it makes it much more interesting from the perspective of biometrics. And today we have a lot of devices that, some of which are compatible to be worn with an AR or a VR headset. They're relatively quick to set up, they're completely wireless, and they're wearable, as you can see. And we now have algorithms in the software that automatically detect interesting patterns in the data, often in real time. So we can see things like changes in emotional response or particular types of brain activity associated with high engagement or cognitive workload. So the moderator can see this in real time, and any observers watching the research can also follow this. So again, some quite powerful insights into what users are thinking and doing. That's the end of my talk. The message is really just to encourage everyone to try and do as much testing with your actual users as possible. You'll be surprised how much it helps you to improve the UX. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip. Any questions for Philip? Okay.
Thank you. Have you seen any tools for prototyping similar to what you'd see with Envision for websites, but for AR?
So the best I've seen is Sketchbox. It's mainly for VR, but they say VR is a great way to prototype for AR, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. So I would maybe encourage you to try that one. It's free, actually. So Sketchbox. You've seen that one. What do you think? Yeah, it's definitely quicker than Unity. Okay, yeah, I haven't heard about that one. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll check that one out, thank you.
Any more questions?
Hello, great talk. Thank you very much. And I would like to ask you, because sometimes we are involved in making some kind of product that is designed for specific people, but mostly of them, this is a good example for a specific this conference, where we are making a VR or AR training tool for some kind of process, and the people that we are meant to use it are not specifically trained in this technology, or they are just, or they did never use it. So during training sessions, playtesting, sometimes, like you've mentioned, we are using task-based questions to guide the people how they should use it. But how to construct a good question, because sometimes, like in your video, you've been asked, how do you feel, how do you think something in particular interactive object should have been noticed, or how should it be highlighted, or whatever else. And when someone does never used this kind of technology, do you think this question is in a good place? Is it relevant?
It can still be relevant. You obviously modify your questions based on each individual user, if you can. We also come across this problem where you want to test an application, but if your target audience doesn't use that application, it actually takes them half an hour before they're even ready to begin the testing. So we end up having longer sessions and having a bit of training at the beginning. So that's how we try to get around it. Or we say it's for mobile AR, and that app was targeted at people who don't use mobile AR. We got them to download it a week or two before and actually use it for that period of time. So we try and bridge that gap before we do the testing. But in terms of if you can't do that, I don't know if there's like one answer other than you have to do your best to, exactly as you say, take that into consideration, that certain questions just are not appropriate, and you have to maybe just patiently observe several users having the problem. They may not be able to explain to you why that is, but you can make your own inferences just by observing.
Okay, can I have one again question? Okay, the last one would be, sometimes as a measure function, I use the time that user achieves a certain goal based on the task-based guidance. And do you find this kind of measure, I don't know if you already use it or not, do you find it a good way, especially in case of problem of generalization? That means if a user experience the same problem many times, he gets used to it and gets somehow better. But if you guide him in some way, if he finds it in his own way, which type of learning is for you better, and do you think this measure is good?
So the question is task completion time a useful measure? Can I ask, are you using that for kind of like enterprise type tasks, workflows, or more kind of consumer applications?
Both.
Yeah, so I find it's more useful if you're trying to prove ROI or savings or efficiency. I try not to use it for regular consumer apps. One, because they'll behave differently at home and they will learn. And secondly, because if you want to get an accurate measure of the time, you have to completely change your methodology. So you have to have a consistent start and end point for every user. You have to define that very clearly, and you cannot talk to them. You can't ask them a question because obviously then you're affecting the time. So you have to put quite a lot of effort into try and making that time actually realistic. So I wouldn't use it too much for consumer. I'd only use it if you're trying to really show that you're significantly cutting down the time in an enterprise setting.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. What do you think about the future of like a legal policies when you're doing like a data extraction of user behavior? For example, you're tracking the gaze control, hand movements, gestures, voice, mimics, everything like in one package, right? And so, what is the future of legal policies, like a relationship between like a government and the data extraction of user behavior?
Sorry, could you?
Yeah. Sorry. What do you think about the future of legal policy?
Legal policy.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
You're asking the wrong guy here. I have no idea. What we often see is obviously government legislation follows behind technological advances by many years. So probably it'll be Wild West. Then we'll start to see problems. And then the media will latch on to things, and then the government will take action. That's kind of the patterns I typically see.
As always.
So I'd say it's the same prediction here. Yeah, I have no idea about the legal side.
So many questions.
Of course, if you're testing a product or an application, you have one target audience that you're trying the application with, I guess.
You can have one or many different segments.
Did you also try like different generations then?
If that's your target audience, yes.
And if not, did you try it also?
Me personally?
Yes.
Do you mean have I tested with, say, elderly and children?
Yes.
I do research with elderly and children. With VR and AR, haven't done as much because VR headsets legally they usually have a minimum age of say 14 plus. I don't know what the reason for this is. I think it's just safety first. But what we do here is when we give people the technology to use at home, what we hear consistently is that the kids take it over. So the kids use it more than anyone. They're the most impressed with mobile VR, mobile AR. And we've heard the same with Alexa and voice, that now kids are the main users. Same thing that happened with the iPad. And it's really interesting because often we create a technology for adults, for ourselves, and the ultimate user, when it really takes off and becomes successful, could be a completely different segment.
Yeah.
So we should keep definitely our eyes open on these other segments.
Okay, thanks.
So I guess one more question will fit in. So here you go.
Hi, I was wondering if you could recommend any sort of tips and tricks for UI in AR when you can't completely control the environment. So, for instance, when you're showing the 3D object being put on a desk and the white ring filled, if that was on a white table, I think you'd find it quite hard to see. Is there any way you can sort of control that contrast, or any UI tips to?
I haven't seen people controlling the contrast. What I've seen is on-screen tips and guidance to say try a darker surface or try something with more texture. And actually there's a lot of research into what works and doesn't work. For example, text prompts saying do this while somebody's trying to scan a surface aren't very effective. Animations showing you what you should be doing with no words are much more effective. So another tip that you could have is if you haven't successfully scanned a surface within, say, a particular time period, you could kind of escalate the prompts. So then you could say, try something less shiny or try something darker. I don't know if that answers your question, but happy to talk afterwards.
Thank you.